The chamber is silent, but heavy with tension. Sunlight cuts through narrow windows, striking the polished marble floor of the Curia. Senators in white togas sit in a semicircle, their faces hard, their minds sharp. The fate of provinces, armies, and even the lives of men rests in their decisions. They are not kings, yet kings tremble before them. They are not soldiers, yet they command legions. This is the Roman Senate, the heart of Roman politics, the engine of power that drove an empire. To understand Rome, you must first understand the Senate. Part 1. Origins and evolution of the Senate. The Roman Senate was one of the most enduring political institutions of the ancient world. It outlived kings, guided the republic, and adapted itself to the rule of emperors. Its roots stretched back into Rome's earliest days, when the city was still ruled by kings. In those primitive years, the Senate was little more than a council of elders, chosen from Rome's leading families, who advised the monarch. The Latin word senatus itself came from senex, meaning old man, a reminder that wisdom, age, and aristocratic prestige were the foundation of this council. The Senate in the Age of Kings, during the monarchy, which tradition says began with Romulus in 753 BCE, Rome was ruled by a succession of kings. These kings held supreme power, both religious and political, but they rarely ruled without consultation. To govern effectively, they needed the support of the city's wealthiest and most influential families, the patricians. The Senate, therefore, emerged as the king's advisory body, composed of 100 men at first, later expanded to 300. They held no formal executive power, but their influence was significant. If a king died, it was the Senate that managed affairs of state until a new monarch was chosen. In this early period, the Senate represented continuity. Kings came and went, but the Senate endured, its members drawn from Rome's aristocracy, whose authority and prestige were deeply rooted in land ownership and ancestral tradition. Already, the seeds of what the Senate would become were visible, an institution that outlasted individuals, one that claimed to embody the wisdom and tradition of Rome. From monarchy to republic, the turning point came in 509 BCE, when Rome expelled its last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, and established the Republic. With no monarch to rule, the Senate stepped into a new role. The Republic introduced magistrates, consuls, praetors, and others who were elected annually and given executive authority. But magistrates were temporary, while the Senate was permanent. This gave the Senate both stability and continuity. At first, the Senate's power was informal. It advised magistrates, issued decrees, and shaped public policy, but it could not pass laws directly. Yet as the Republic matured, its influence expanded. Magistrates depended on Senate approval to secure funds, assign military commands, and manage conquered territories. Little by little, the Senate transformed from an advisory body into the central organ of Roman governance. Patricians, plebeians, and the struggle for inclusion. In its early days, the Senate was a club of patricians, the noble families of Rome. Plebeians, the common citizens, were excluded. This imbalance fueled what is known as the struggle of the orders, a centuries-long conflict between patricians and plebeians. Through protests, secessions, and negotiations, plebeians gradually secured more rights. The creation of the office of the tribune, who could veto laws and protect plebeian interests, was one major victory. Over time, plebeians won access to the highest magistracies, including the consulship, since former magistrates were typically admitted into the Senate. This meant that plebeian families gradually gained seats as well. By the 3rd century BCE, the Senate had evolved into a body that, while still dominated by aristocracy, included both patrician and plebeian elites. This fusion of old and new nobility formed the backbone of Rome's ruling class. Powers of the Senate. By the Middle Republic, the Senate had accumulated vast powers, though it could not formally enact laws that remained the domain of the popular assemblies. It controlled almost every other aspect of governance. Its responsibilities included foreign policy. The Senate decided questions of war and peace, negotiated treaties, and sent ambassadors abroad. In matters of diplomacy, it was supreme. Finance. Control of the treasury gave the Senate immense leverage. Magistrates needed Senate approval to fund military campaigns, public works, or festivals. Without Senate support, their power was hollow. Military affairs. While consuls commanded armies, the Senate determined how many legions would be raised, where they would be deployed, and how they would be supplied. Provincial administration. As Rome expanded, the Senate assigned governors to provinces, supervised their conduct, and received reports on their performance. This control over the provinces gave senators direct influence over Rome's growing empire. Religion. The Senate also had a role in religious affairs, consulting priests, managing temples, and authorizing ceremonies thought necessary for the safety of the state. The Senate's authority was expressed through senators' consulted decrees of the Senate. Though technically advisory, in practice they carried the force of law, since magistrates almost always followed them. Prestige and symbolism. Being a senator was not merely a political office seat, it was a symbol of immense prestige. Senators wore the toga with a broad purple stripe, the latus clavis, marking their status. They sat in reserved seats at public events, and their opinions were sought first in debates. Membership in the Senate was for life, unless a man was expelled for misconduct by the censors. This prestige was not only social but also moral. The Senate claimed to embody the collective wisdom of Rome's greatest men. In theory, senators put the interests of the Republic above their own. In reality, ambition and rivalry were constant companions, but the ideal of senatorial dignity auctoritas senatus remained a powerful force in Roman political culture. Senator and the people. The Senate's relationship with the Roman people was complex. Technically, sovereignty resided with the people, who elected magistrates and passed laws in assemblies. But the Senate shaped the choices available to the people, controlled debate, and managed the state's day-to-day affairs. To ordinary Romans, the Senate was both a symbol of aristocratic dominance and a guardian of stability. When crises struck, wars, famines, revolts, the Senate was expected to provide leadership. Its authority came not from brute force but from tradition, prestige, and the perception that it represented the collective will of Rome's elite. This balance of power between the Senate, magistrates, and assemblies created the unique political system of the Republic. Examples of early Senate power. The Senate's role in Rome's early wars reveals its growing authority. During the wars with the Samnites and later with Pyrrhus of Epirus, the Senate managed resources, debated strategy, and directed Rome's military expansion. When Carthage emerged as a rival, it was the Senate that authorized treaties, oversaw alliances, and guided the Republic into the Punic Wars. The Senate's control over finance was particularly crucial in these conflicts. Raising legions required money, as did supplying them with arms and provisions. By holding the purse strings, the Senate ensured that even Rome's most powerful generals remained dependent on its favor. An institution of continuity. What made the Senate unique was its permanence. Consuls and praetors came and went each year, but the Senate endured. This gave it institutional memory and the ability to pursue long-term strategies. It was not simply a council of men, it was the embodiment of Roman tradition, the living voice of the ancestors. Even when individuals defied it, the Senate remained. This continuity allowed Rome to expand from a small city-state into a Mediterranean superpower. The Senate provided the stability and governance needed to administer conquered lands and integrate new peoples into the Republic. The early centuries of the Senate's history show an institution that grew from an advisory council of elders into the most powerful political body in the Republic. Its authority rested not on written law, but on tradition, prestige, and the collective power of Rome's aristocracy. It guided the Republic through wars, managed its finances, and oversaw the expansion of its empire. For generations, it seemed unshakable, the eternal guardian of Rome's destiny. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Ambition, corruption, and the widening gap between the Senate and the Roman people would soon test its resilience. the Republic's most powerful institution, would become the stage for its greatest conflicts. Part 2. The Senate in the late Republic. The Roman Senate during the late Republic was very different from the respected body that had guided Rome through the Middle Republic. The years after Rome's major conquests saw the Senate confronted with new pressures that it struggled to manage. From the 2nd century BCE until the rise of Augustus, the Senate's power was increasingly challenged. Political violence, social tensions, corruption, and the rise of military strongmen all contributed to the decline of senatorial authority, expansion of Rome, and administrative problems. After the Punic Wars and the conquest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Senate was suddenly responsible for ruling a Mediterranean empire. The Republic now controlled provinces in Spain, North Africa, Greece, and Asia Minor. Senators, who had once only needed to guide the affairs of Italy, were now in charge of tax systems, provincial administration, and foreign diplomacy. The Senate relied on governors, usually former consuls or praetors, to manage these provinces. These governors had enormous power, and oversight from Rome was weak. As a result, abuses were common. Governors enriched themselves by overtaxing local populations, taking bribes, or plundering resources. Provincial subjects often petitioned Rome to punish corrupt officials, but the Senate was reluctant to act against its own members. This fostered resentment abroad and reinforced the image of the Senate as an elite body concerned only with its own enrichment. The growing social divide. Wealth from conquest flowed into Rome, but it was not distributed evenly. Senators and the equestrian class benefited the most. Large estates, latifondia, expanded as aristocrats bought up land, often using slave labor from conquests to work the fields. At the same time, many small farmers lost their property. Wars kept citizens away from their farms for years, and debts forced them to sell. This created a growing urban population of poor citizens who relied on grain distributions and looked to political leaders for support. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats, had little interest in addressing their needs. This social divide created fertile ground for reform movements and demagogues. The Gracchi and the erosion of tradition. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tribunes of the plebs in the late 2nd century BCE, exposed the Senate's weaknesses. Both brothers proposed reforms to address land distribution and economic inequality. They bypassed the Senate by appealing directly to the popular assemblies. This challenged the Senate's customary authority. The Senate responded with hostility. Tiberius was killed in 133 BCE during political unrest, and Gaius was killed with thousands of his supporters in 121 BCE after the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum ultimate decree, effectively declaring emergency powers. These episodes marked the beginning of open violence in Roman politics. By resorting to violence, the Senate demonstrated that it could not resolve conflicts through consensus. By ignoring popular grievances, it lost legitimacy among the people. The rise of military loyalty to generals. The Senate also faced difficulties with the military system. Traditionally, soldiers were property-owning citizens loyal to the Republic. But as more citizens lost land, recruitment became harder. Gaius Marius reformed the army around 107 BCE, allowing landless citizens to enlist. This professionalized the army, but also shifted loyalty from the state to individual commanders. Soldiers now depended on their generals for pay, plunder, and land upon retirement. Generals became political figures with private armies, capable of challenging the Senate. The Senate, which lacked a permanent military force of its own, was unable to balance this new reality. Sulla and dictatorship. Lucius Cornelius Sulla illustrated this new stage in Roman politics. When his command was threatened in 88 BCE, he marched his army on Rome itself. This unprecedented action showed that military force could decide political outcomes. Sulla later became dictator and enacted reforms meant to strengthen the Senate. He increased its size, limited the powers of the tribunes, and reinforced senatorial control over courts and administration. For a short time, These measures restored stability, but Sulla also demonstrated that power ultimately lay with those who commanded armies. His example set a dangerous precedent for future leaders: Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. In the following decades, the Senate struggled with figures such as Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar. Pompey achieved great military success in the East and returned to Rome seeking land for his veterans and recognition of his settlements. The Senate resisted, hoping to weaken him. This resistance pushed Pompey to form an alliance with Crassus and Caesar in 60 BCE, known as the First Triumvirate. Together, they bypassed the Senate, using their combined influence to dominate Roman politics. Caesar's subsequent conquest of Gaul made him enormously powerful. When the Senate attempted to recall Caesar and strip him of his command, he crossed the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, beginning a civil war. The Senate was divided, with some supporting Pompey and others Caesar. Ultimately, Caesar emerged victorious. The decline of authority. Under Caesar, the Senate still existed but was reduced to a supportive role. He expanded its membership and used it to ratify his decisions. While senators continued to meet, they no longer guided policy. The assassination of Caesar in 44 BCE was carried out by senators who hoped to restore the old republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into further civil war. The Senate had little control during the struggles between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. By the time Octavian defeated his rivals, the Senate's role as an independent governing body was over. Structural weaknesses of the Senate. The late Republic exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the Senate. 1. Dependence on custom. The Senate's authority was based on tradition rather than law. When ambitious leaders ignored those traditions, the Senate had no effective enforcement mechanism. 2. Lack of military power. The Senate had no army of its own. Control of legions lay with generals, and soldiers were more loyal to their commanders than to the Senate. 3. Resistance to reform. The Senate's aristocratic leadership resisted land reform, debt relief, and social changes that might have addressed popular grievances. This alienated the urban poor and the provinces. 4. Internal divisions. Senators were divided into factions, often more concerned with personal rivalry than the survival of the Republic. 5. Reliance on violence. By sanctioning political violence against opponents such as the Gracchi, the Senate undermined the tradition of peaceful governance. The end of the Republic. By the final decades of the 1st century BCE, the Senate no longer directed Roman politics. Generals like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar had proven that military power outweighed senatorial decrees. The Senate became a stage on which ambitious men sought legitimacy, but it was no longer the true center of decision-making. The civil wars of the late Republic destroyed the Senate's remaining authority. When Augustus emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, he retained the Senate but stripped it of real power. It became an advisory body within the new imperial system, honored for tradition but politically subordinate. The Senate in the late Republic reveals the decline of an institution unable to adapt to the demands of empire. Corruption, resistance to reform, dependence on tradition, and the rise of military leaders all eroded its position. What had once been the guiding council of the Republic became increasingly irrelevant. By the end of the century, the Senate had lost its central role. The age of the Republic was over, and the Senate would survive only as a ceremonial body under the emperors. Part 3. The Senate under the Empire. The transition from Republic to Empire marked a profound change in the role and nature of the Roman Senate. Once the most powerful institution in Rome, the Senate became a body with limited influence under the emperors. Although it was preserved for the sake of tradition and prestige, the Senate no longer controlled policy, armies, or finances. Instead, it became an advisory and ceremonial institution. This chapter explores how the Senate functioned under the emperors, how it adapted to its new place in the imperial system, and how it ultimately survived as a symbol rather than a center of power. Augustus and the transformation of the Senate. When Augustus, formerly Octavian, became the first emperor in 27 BCE, he understood the importance of appearances. He did not abolish the Senate. Instead, he reshaped it to serve his purposes. Augustus reduced its size from around 1,000 members, swollen during Caesar's dictatorship, to about 600. He expelled senators he deemed unworthy, re-establishing a sense of dignity. Augustus presented himself as the Princeps Senatus, first man of the Senate, a title that emphasized leadership without claiming monarchy. He regularly consulted the Senate, allowing it to debate issues and pass decrees. But in practice, the Senate could only ratify decisions that Augustus had already made. The Senate continued to govern provinces, but only those considered peaceful and less strategically important. The emperor kept direct control of the most militarized provinces where legions were stationed. This meant the Senate had no real power over the army. Since ultimate authority in Rome now rested on military force, the Senate could no longer claim to be the leading organ of government. The Senate's ceremonial and advisory role. Under Augustus and his successors, the Senate retained significant prestige. Senators continued to come from Rome's wealthiest families. Membership was still an honor, and the Senate remained a marker of aristocratic status. Senators were expected to participate in debates, oversee certain provincial matters, and conduct ceremonies. The Senate also performed judicial functions. Important trials involving treason, corruption, or mismanagement of provinces were heard before the Senate. However, the emperor could always intervene, and senators were careful not to contradict imperial wishes. Advisory discussions in the Senate gave the impression of shared government, but emperors made the critical decisions. For example, military campaigns, foreign policy, and finances were largely directed from the imperial household and the emperor's council of close advisors. Emperors and the Senate, a delicate relationship. The relationship between emperor and Senate varied depending on the personality of the ruler. Augustus cultivated cooperation, treating senators with respect and using their presence to legitimize his authority. Tiberius, his successor, also maintained the Senate's dignity, but became increasingly withdrawn, leaving senators uncertain of his intentions. Some emperors humiliated the Senate. Caligula mocked senators, forced them to perform degrading tasks, and made clear that they held no real power. Nero, though he initially relied on senatorial support, later ignored or persecuted senators. Such treatment eroded the Senate's prestige. Other emperors, like Vespasian and Trajan, restored some cooperation, recognizing that the Senate could provide stability. They encouraged senators to serve as governors, consuls, and administrators, but always under imperial oversight. Even the best emperors did not share power in the way the Republic once had. The Senate could advise, but the emperor could ignore. The Senate's role in succession. One important function that the Senate retained was its role in imperial succession. While emperors usually designated their heirs, the Senate formally conferred titles. For example, when Augustus died in 14 CE, the Senate officially granted Tiberius imperial powers. This provided legitimacy, even if the decision was largely symbolic. In times of crisis, the Senate could still play a role. After Caligula was assassinated in 41 CE, some senators debated restoring the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard quickly declared Claudius emperor, and the Senate had no choice but to confirm the decision. Similarly, during the chaotic year of the four emperors in 69 CE, the Senate endorsed whoever had the strongest military backing. The reality was clear. The Senate could not choose emperors on its own. Its role was to ratify the outcome of military or political struggles, declining political relevance. Over time, the Senate's relevance declined further. The imperial bureaucracy grew under emperors like Claudius and Hadrian, staffed by equestrians and freedmen loyal to the emperor. These officials managed finance, administration, and the army more effectively than the Senate could. Senators still governed some provinces and held prestigious titles such as consul, But these roles were increasingly ceremonial. Real power resided with the emperor and his personal staff. Senators became part of Rome's social elite rather than its ruling council. By the 3rd century CE, the Senate's influence had nearly vanished. Emperors such as Diocletian and Constantine centralized authority even more, relying on military officials and bureaucrats rather than senators. The Senate of Rome continued to exist, but its functions were largely honorary. The Senate in the later empire, even as its political role diminished, the Senate retained cultural importance. It symbolized the continuity of Roman tradition. Emperors often addressed the Senate when announcing major events, not because they needed its approval, but because the institution carried historical weight. When Constantine established Constantinople as a new capital, he also created a Senate there. This demonstrated the prestige of the senatorial institution, even though it no longer wielded real power. The Senate's survival into late antiquity shows how deeply embedded it was in Roman identity. Reasons for survival. Why did the emperors keep the Senate at all? Several reasons explain this. Tradition. The Senate was one of Rome's oldest institutions. To abolish it would have appeared too radical. By preserving it, emperors linked themselves to Rome's past. Prestige. Senators came from Rome's wealthiest families, including them in government, maintained aristocratic support, and avoided alienating elites. Legitimacy. Having the Senate ratify decisions made imperial authority seem lawful and acceptable to the Roman people. Ceremony. The Senate provided a stage for rituals, honors, and celebrations that reinforced imperial power. The Senate survived because it served the emperor's interests, not because it retained real independence. Legacy of the Senate. Although the Senate under the Empire was no longer the governing body of Rome, it left a lasting legacy. It represented the memory of the Republic and the idea of aristocratic participation in government. The word Senate, derived from the Latin senex, old man, became a symbol of council and authority in later cultures. In medieval and modern Europe, the concept of a Senate reappeared in various forms, inspired by the Roman model. Even though the Roman Senate of the Empire was largely powerless, the idea of a council of elders advising rulers endured. The history of the Roman Senate tells the story of political transformation. In the early Republic, it was the central institution of governance, guiding Rome through wars and expansion. In the Middle Republic, it reached the height of its power, directing the conquest of the Mediterranean. In the late Republic, it faltered, unable to manage empire, social tensions, and ambitious generals. By the time of Augustus, the Senate was preserved for appearance, but stripped of its true power. For centuries afterward, it functioned as an advisory and ceremonial body. Under the emperors, it survived, not because it ruled, but because it symbolized Rome's traditions. The decline of the Senate illustrates how institutions can endure and form long after they lose substance. What mattered in Rome was not the Senate's decrees, but the emperor's command and the loyalty of the armies. Yet the Senate's persistence reminds us of Rome's deep respect for tradition, even as the substance of power shifted. In the end, the Senate that once governed a republic became a relic of empire. It endured as a name, a building, and an honor, but the reality of Roman politics lay elsewhere. The story of the Senate is a story of rise, dominance, decline, and symbolic survival, and institution that outlived its own power, standing as a reminder of a republic that gave way to empire.